I came back home that evening expecting the usual routine. The quiet shuffle into the house, the gentle clink of plates coming from the kitchen, the faint smell of rosemary or sage drifting from the oven. Madison always lit a candle before dinner. She said it made things feel warm, intentional, like our home was still something worth nurturing. Most nights, I barely noticed the glow. Tonight, though, it was the first thing I looked for. The house was silent. Not peaceful silent, but vacant silent. Like it had been holding its breath all day, waiting for something to give. I shut the door behind me and stepped inside. My briefcase slipped from my hand onto the floor, more from instinct than thought. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the dining room, not facing me, but the wall, arms crossed tightly over her chest like she was bracing against a storm only she could feel. Her hair was up in one of those messy buns she wore when she was too busy to bother with appearances, but even from behind, I could see how tense her posture was, shoulders rigid, spine straight, heels planted like roots into the hardwood. "Madison," I said her name gently, unsure of what I was stepping into. She didn't answer, not at first. Just turned her head slightly so I could see the edge of her cheek, flushed and tight, jaw clenched like she'd been biting back words for hours. Or days. I wasn't sure. The table was set. 2 places, napkins folded, wine poured just below the halfway mark in each glass. Her way of saying I care without having to say anything at all. Dinner sat untouched in the center of the table. Steam still curled off the mashed potatoes, but the meat was already starting to cool and crust over. And yet she hadn't moved to eat. She was just standing there, as if the effort it took to go through the motions had drained her dry. Something had broken. Not tonight. Not in this moment. No, whatever this was, it had cracked a long time ago, and I was just now seeing the fracture lines. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. Did something happen? A weak, stupid question. I realized the moment it left my lips. Something had clearly happened, but she still didn't answer. Her eyes finally met mine, and I swear, for a second, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. There was no rage in her expression, no dramatic tears, just this weary, simmering frustration that had been layered so deep it had nowhere else to go. I racked my brain. What I missed. The last few weeks came rushing in like a slideshow. Sunday dinners with my family that always fell on her. She cooked. She cleaned. She coordinated, played hostess, smiled through my mother's passive comments about the seasoning being a little bold or how the napkins weren't folded like they used to be. She never said a word in protest. She just kept going. Then there were my nieces and nephews, dropped off for hours at a time with little warning, because somehow our house had become the designated safe place for everyone's chaos but our own. And I let it happen. I let her carry it all. And each time she asked for a break, I gave her some line like, "You always make it work," or "It's just a couple hours." It wasn't just a couple hours. It was years of being taken for granted, layer after layer, until she was buried in it. I stepped closer into the silence, into the weight of everything I hadn't seen. "I can't keep doing this, John." Her voice was low but steady. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just said it like it was a fact, like she was finally giving language to something she'd known for a long time. I opened my mouth, but there was nothing I could say that didn't sound hollow. She turned and walked down the hall, and I didn't follow. I stood there, in the echo of her words, in the middle of a dining room that had been set with care and now felt like a stage after the actors had left. The food was untouched. The candles still flickered. But everything had changed. I sat down in my usual spot, the fork cold in my hand, and stared at the plate she'd made for me. I had assumed for so long that love was something shown in big gestures. But it was also here, in the way she seasoned the potatoes just how I liked, in the folded napkins and the wine pour before I arrived. And I had missed it all. By the time I looked up again, the candle was nearly burned down. The next morning, I woke up early, but I didn't move right away. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of the house. Madison wasn't beside me. The sheets on her side were cool and untouched, her pillow perfectly shaped, like she hadn't slept there at all. Maybe she didn't. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and sat there for a long time, elbows on my knees, palms pressed together. I had never been good with silence. I always filled it, with TV, with errands, with noise. But now it was all I had, and every second of it pressed against my skin like a weight I couldn't shake. She didn't speak to me that morning. We passed each other in the hallway. She had a laundry basket tucked under one arm and a mug in the other. Her eyes were red, like she'd cried but didn't want anyone to notice. She didn't stop walking, just a nod. That was all. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't know where to begin. Sorry felt too small. An explanation would sound like an excuse. So I let her pass. I went to work, though I don't remember a single thing I did there. My mind kept circling the night before, replaying every detail. The way she stood so still, how she said those 8 words like they were written on her bones. I can't keep doing this, John. That sentence echoed in everything I touched. When I answered emails, when I poured coffee, when I stared blankly at a spreadsheet I couldn't bring myself to understand. By the time I came home, the house was clean again. Dishes washed, counters wiped down, a scented candle burning near the window. At first, I felt a strange flicker of relief. Maybe she'd calmed down. Maybe we'd sit down and talk like we always did after arguments. Soft voices, long pauses, apologies made over leftovers. But when I opened the bedroom door, I saw the suitcase. It wasn't hers. It was mine. She hadn't said a word, but she'd gone into the closet, pulled out the old overnight bag I used for business trips, and left it neatly on the bed. Empty. Waiting. The message wasn't loud, but it was clear. Something cracked open in me then. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just this quiet understanding that maybe, for the first time, it was my turn to do something uncomfortable. To take the weight for once. So I did. I packed a few things, just the essentials. A couple of shirts, a pair of jeans, my toothbrush, phone charger. I left my laptop behind. It didn't feel like a time for distraction. I wasn't running away. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just needed to step out of the picture for a moment, to let the silence between us breathe, instead of suffocating us both inside it. I left her a note on the kitchen counter. Just a simple one. I need to understand what I've missed. I'll be back in a few days. Jay. And then I left. I didn't drive far. Just a half hour to a little motel I remembered from years ago on the edge of the next town. The kind of place you check into when you don't want questions. The walls were thin and the bed was stiff, but it didn't matter. I wasn't there for comfort. I was there for space. The first night was hard. I kept staring at the ceiling, the glow of the television flickering across the room, even though I wasn't watching anything. I thought about calling her, just to say I was safe, to hear her voice. But I didn't. I had a feeling she didn't want to hear from me. Not yet. Instead, I started thinking about everything I'd ignored. I thought about the way she carried our life like a quiet engine, never stalling, always moving, always fixing. She paid the bills on time. She remembered birthdays. She made grocery lists and left reminders on the fridge. She handled my family's chaos like it was part of her job description, and I never once asked her how she felt about it. I didn't mean to take her for granted. I truly didn't. But meaning well and doing right aren't the same thing. I had let her become invisible one little moment at a time. 3 days passed. I kept the same routine. Coffee in the morning, walks around the block, old takeout dinners eaten from paper bags. I didn't reach out to her. I wanted to, but I needed to wait until I could show up with something more than just words. On the third night, I sat at the edge of the motel bed and stared at my reflection in the dark window. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. Tired, older than I remembered, but clearer, sharper around the edges. Like I'd finally woken up. That night, I decided I'd go home the next morning. Not to talk, not to make a speech, just to see, to witness what the house looked like without her effort, to finally notice what had been there all along. I owed her that much. At the very least, I owed her that. I pulled into the driveway, just after noon. The neighborhood looked the same. Quiet, calm. The cul-de-sac where kids used to ride bikes was still empty on weekdays, and Mrs. Langley's hydrangeas were in full bloom, crowding the sidewalk like always. Nothing outside had changed, but when I stepped out of the car, I hesitated. My hand hovered near the door handle longer than it should have. I had lived in this house for 9 years, and for the first time, I didn't know what I was walking into. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not terrible, just different. No lavender candle. No lemon polish. Just stale air, and something faintly metallic, like a kitchen sponge that hadn't been wrung out in days. It wasn't homey. It was just space. The lights were off. The curtains hadn't been opened, and everything was still. I walked slowly through the house, letting my eyes adjust, letting the reality of it all sink in. The first thing I noticed was the clutter. Not the kind that screamed chaos, but the subtle signs of life losing its grip. There were dishes in the sink, plates crusted over with congealed sauce, a mug stained with cold coffee. Madison never left dishes overnight. Even after long days, she'd hum quietly as she scrubbed them clean, like it gave her some small peace. Now they sat there untouched, like a stopped clock. In the living room, toys were scattered across the rug. Not ours. We didn't have kids, but the ones our nieces and nephews brought over. A plastic truck, a puzzle missing pieces, a blanket balled up in the corner. I picked it up, held it in my hands, and realized something I hadn't before. None of this was mine. None of this mess belonged to me. And yet it had always been Madison who cleaned it up. I kept moving. The dining room table still held the plates from that night. The night I came home to find her standing there like a statue. The night she said, "I can't keep doing this, John." The food was gone, but the crumbs remained. The wine glasses had left faint rings on the wood. One of the candles had melted down completely, its wax spilling onto the table runner. I walked into the bedroom and saw that her side of the bed was made perfectly, like she hadn't slept in it at all. My side, however, was a mess of rumpled sheets and forgotten clothes. I hadn't even noticed the imbalance before. She'd always reset the bed, both sides, as if both of us deserved comfort. Now, she was only responsible for herself. And maybe that was the point. I stood in the middle of the room, taking in the silence, trying to map my memories over the current mess. This house used to feel like it belonged to both of us. Now it felt borrowed, like I was stepping into a space where someone had once lived, someone who had finally walked away from the noise. I wandered back to the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was half empty, leftover containers shoved to the side, produce starting to wilt. Madison used to stock it like a grocery aisle, labeled containers, fresh fruit, sauces in neat rows. She once joked that she ran our kitchen like a tiny restaurant. I laughed. I never asked her how much time it took. Now I understood. The more I looked, the more I realized just how many things Madison had done that I never saw. Clean laundry folded into our drawers. The coffee pot prepped at night, so it brewed before we woke. The bills paid, the calendar updated, the birthday cards written in my name. Her fingerprints were everywhere, but faint, fading now, like the ghost of a routine that had been abandoned. She hadn't left the house, but she had stopped holding it together. And without her, the seams were showing. I sat down at the kitchen table and let out a long breath. It felt heavier than it should have, not because the house was falling apart, but because now I could finally see the truth. We had built a life where one person carried the weight and the other never noticed. She had made it look easy, and I had let her. It wasn't just about the dishes or the planning or the endless dinners. It was the way I had stopped asking how she was. The way I had assumed her silence meant satisfaction. The way I had confused her strength for an endless supply of energy. And now here we were. I got up slowly, walked back through the hallway, and stopped outside the guest room. The door was half shut. I pushed it open and saw that she'd moved in there. Her robe hung on the back of the chair. A book sat face down on the nightstand. She wasn't gone, but she had retreated. Not physically, but emotionally. And that somehow felt worse. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't know how to reach her. I stood in the doorway, gripping the frame, staring at the room like it was a locked box I no longer had the key to. This was the house we had built together, and I had somehow let it become a place where she felt alone. I knew now that coming back wasn't enough. If I wanted to fix this, if I truly wanted her to stay, I would have to rebuild something much harder than a clean kitchen or a fresh start. I would have to rebuild her trust. And that started with admitting how long I'd been asleep. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room long after the lights went out. The house creaked around me. Soft, tired sounds I'd never noticed before. Maybe they'd always been there, but Madison had filled the space so fully that they'd gotten drowned out by her rhythm. Without her movement, without her presence, the the silence was full of sound. I stared at the photo on the mantel. It was from our 4th anniversary, taken at that little vineyard upstate. We were laughing at something, I don't even remember what, but the moment was frozen in time. She had her hand on my chest, her head tilted toward mine, and I looked completely unaware of how lucky I was. I got up and quietly began to clean, not out of guilt. At least, not only out of guilt, but because I finally understood the weight of what she'd carried. I started with the dishes, scraped off hardened leftovers, soaked the worst ones, scrubbed the others until the sink was empty. Then the counters. Then the stove. I threw out old leftovers, wiped down the refrigerator shelves, organized what was left. I wasn't trying to earn forgiveness. I wasn't even sure she'd notice. But I had to start somewhere. I needed to feel with my hands what she had been doing for years without recognition. After the kitchen, I moved to the living room, folded blankets, gathered toys, and stuffed them into the plastic bin we kept in the closet. I even dusted the windowsills, which was something I hadn't done since we moved in. It was past 2 a.m. when I finished. The house was quiet again, but this time, it felt a little less hollow. I didn't expect her to walk out and thank me. I didn't expect anything, really. I just wanted her to know that I had seen. Finally, I had seen. In the morning, she didn't say anything about it. She walked past the kitchen and paused for half a second, eyes skimming the clean counters. Her gaze flicked to me, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee. But she didn't speak. She simply nodded and moved on. I didn't follow her. I didn't rush the moment. A nod was more than silence. It was something. Later that day, I sat down with a piece of paper and wrote a list. Not a to-do list, a real list of everything I remembered her doing for this house, for us, that I had ignored or assumed happened by magic. I filled the front and back. Laundry, groceries, vet appointments, family birthdays, holiday decorations, dentist reminders, paper towels, tea she bought just for my mother, the way she made the bed with 2 blankets because I liked one and she liked another. When I finished the list, I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't even scratched the surface. There were things she did that I still didn't know. That night, I asked her if she had a moment. She looked surprised. It had been days since I asked for her time, rather than assumed I was entitled to it. She hesitated, then sat down across from me at the kitchen table. I didn't launch into apologies. I didn't make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I slid the paper across the table. She read it slowly. Her eyes didn't move like they were scanning. It looked like she was absorbing each word, each bullet point, as if waiting for the catch. But there wasn't one. When she finished, she looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like months, her eyes softened. I didn't know how bad it had gotten, I said, voice low. I didn't want to see it. I convinced myself everything was fine because it worked. Because you made it work. She didn't answer right away. She just breathed in deeply and looked away, out the window. There were streaks of sun setting across the sky, orange, gold, and soft purple. The kind of evening light she used to comment on, saying it made the world look like it was holding its breath. You didn't want to see it, she finally said, because you didn't have to. That landed like a stone. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. I hadn't had to. She'd made it easy for me not to look. I want to change that, I said. But I know wanting isn't enough. I have to show you. Not tonight. Not just this week. But long term. And if you don't believe me yet, that's okay. She was quiet again, but her fingers rested on the edge of the paper I gave her. She tapped once gently before standing. Keep going, she said, and she walked away. She wasn't forgiving me. Not yet. She wasn't letting me back into the bedroom or laughing like she used to. But she wasn't walking out either. And that, I realized, was a beginning. The next few weeks weren't cinematic. There was no sweeping reconciliation, no dramatic moment where everything snapped back into place. There was just life, messy, quiet, and uncertain. But something had shifted. Madison still slept in the guest room. I never asked when she planned to come back. That wasn't the point anymore. I knew now that love wasn't measured in proximity. It was measured in presence. And for the first time in years, I was fully present. Every morning, I got up early and made coffee. I didn't just pour it. I learned how she liked it. Splash of oat milk, not too hot. Never the first cup from the pot. I placed it by her usual seat at the kitchen table and left it there without a word. Some days she drank it. Some days she didn't. But I made it anyway. I started taking over the grocery runs. Not just grabbing frozen dinners in a six-pack, but walking the aisles slowly, reading labels, choosing the things she used to remember without writing them down. I didn't do it perfectly. I once brought home the wrong almond butter, and another time I forgot toilet paper entirely. She laughed at that one. A small laugh, but real. It was the first time she'd laughed in front of me in weeks. I began cooking simple meals, things she used to make, things I thought only she could get right. I followed her old recipes from the drawer under the oven, the ones stained with splashes of broth and pencil notes in the margins. My first few tries were rough. The chicken was dry. The rice was underdone. But I kept going, and she didn't correct me. She just sat across the table and ate quietly. The space between us didn't shrink overnight. Some nights, she came home late. Some nights, she stayed silent. But she was still there, still choosing to stay. One afternoon, I found her in the backyard, weeding the herb garden we'd forgotten about. I knelt beside her without saying anything, and for 20 minutes, we pulled weeds together in silence. It wasn't the act that mattered. It was the choice to share the same space without needing words. That was new. That was something. I began therapy, alone at first. I didn't tell her right away. I didn't want to turn it into a performance. But after my third session, I left the appointment card on the fridge. She didn't say anything when she saw it, but later that night, she made 2 cups of tea instead of 1. She handed me mine without a word, and I understood what it meant. The little signs came slowly. A dish towel left folded on my side of the sink. A note scribbled on the grocery list. Get the right almond butter this time. A second pillow placed back on our bed. Not hers, not yet, but mine returned to where it used to be. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of her humming in the kitchen. She hadn't done that in months. I stayed in bed for a moment, listening to it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a performance. She didn't know I was awake. That made it more real. That afternoon, we sat together in the living room with the windows open. The breeze smelled like spring, the first warm air after a long winter. Madison had a book in her lap. I was fixing a loose leg on a coffee table, crouched on the floor with a screwdriver in one hand and a piece of wood in the other. And then she said something I hadn't expected. I didn't think you'd actually come back. I looked up at her. She wasn't accusing me. She wasn't testing me. She was just telling the truth. I didn't either, I said honestly. Not like this, but I needed to come back different. She nodded, then looked out the window. I didn't want to stop loving you, she said, but I couldn't keep doing it alone. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't break. It didn't need to. I know, I said, and I did. Love had become lopsided somewhere along the way. Unintentionally, gradually. She had carried the structure while I enjoyed the view. But now I was learning to build, to sweep the floors, to oil the hinges, to show up, not in grand gestures, but in small, steady ones. That night, she came to bed. She didn't say anything, just slid under the covers, turned toward the wall, and exhaled slowly. Her body didn't touch mine, but I didn't reach for her. I just lay there, listening to her breathe, the rise and fall of it syncing with mine like a rhythm we were both trying to remember. It wasn't a finish line. It wasn't a reward. It was a beginning. Again. And this time, I was awake for it.